communication has been named the most in-demand skill of the future alongside digital literacy, with 40% of current workers' core skills expected to change in the next 5 years. So people think that by 2030, 85% of the jobs that exist now will no longer exist. So there's lots of our jobs that are going to be replaced by machines, and we need to capitalize on the skills that make us human. That is going to be what people are looking for in the future. So how can we become real expert communicators, able to have high quality conversations and really able to connect with other people and solve problems quickly through effective communication? And number one is to communicate with clarity. And to do this, I'm going to recommend that you use the PrEP framework. So every time you go into a conversation, say to yourself, when this person walks away from this conversation, what is it that I really want them to take away? And we talk about this a lot in public speaking and giving presentations and things. You know, we always say, what's your key message? Can you sum it up in 15 words or less? Because when you know exactly what you want that other person to take away from the conversation, you're going to communicate with a lot more impact and a lot more clarity. And a good framework for doing this is to use the PrEP framework, where you outline your point, your reasons for making this point, your evidence, and then you circle back to your point. So, for example, I think that we should introduce this new service to customers. And then the reason I think this is because customers are telling us that this is what they want. Here is some evidence of customers sharing that this is what they want. I can actually show you the evidence. So this is why I think that we should introduce this new service to clients. And when you are communicating that clearly and providing that level of evidence, you don't have to get into a long discussion over it, because you've laid it out exactly your reasoning for why that's a good decision, and you can have a much more productive conversation. So that's number one, communicate with clarity using the PrEP framework. Number two is to communicate with confidence. And that means saying less, but with more impact. So here's a little bit of a taster from our gravitas training that we do with people. It's one of our most popular courses. If you can speak 20% slower in a conversation, what you say is going to make more sense. You're going to be more succinct, you're going to have more clarity, and you also give the other person more time to absorb what you're saying. So aim to speak 20% slower when you're in a meeting, when you're presenting, or when you've got something really important to say. And then use the power of the pregnant pause. So that means that you actually stop when you're speaking and you allow the other person to absorb the message, you yourself buy yourself time to think. And you can have a more thoughtful conversation. Interestingly enough, when you're able to pause as well, that's a really useful technique in a negotiation, because often people will jump in and say something they might regret later. So get used to having a pause, speak 20% slower, and use the downward inflection. So if I say to you, my name's Carrie Swift, I'm from Love Public Speaking, and I'm going up at the end of my sentence in that way, we call that up talk. It doesn't sound like I'm very sure of what I'm saying. Whereas when I use the downward inflection, I say, my name's Carrie Swift and I'm from Love Public Speaking. And there's a downward tone at the end of my sentence. I sound a lot more sure of myself. And with that in mind, I want to bring you on to point number 3, which is to use declarative statements rather than questions. So if you want to have some real gravitas and some authority when you're speaking in a meeting, you want to project confidence and you want to communicate in a way that's high impact, rather than saying something like, can I show you this proposal? You could say, let me show you this proposal. Don't you think this is a good plan? Say, we're confident this is a good plan. Do you think you can meet the deadline? I'll need you to agree to the deadline before we move forward. So instead of asking for information, you are sharing information. Use declarative statements rather than questions. And then hack number 4 is to tell stories to create sticky messages. So we have been using storytelling as long as we have been using language, from drawing primitive art inside caves to sitting around a fire, sharing whatever we can with each other, gossiping. Bringing things to life through emotional content is really powerful. And so the way that we can use this at work is that if we've got an important message to share with somebody, we can turn it into some kind of metaphor or analogy or story to engage people emotionally. So to give you an example of this, if I'm working in the finance team and I say, you know, we're overspending, I'm worried about the budget, instead of saying something like that, I could say something more like, you know, currently we've got some holes to plug in the bottom of the boat while we navigate these choppy waters. And when you create an image like that in somebody's head, that is really powerful. That's actually engaging the senses, and that's going to create what we call a sticky message. So wherever you can, communicate through stories rather than just through facts, because people are actually 22 times more likely to remember a story than a fact. Number 5 is to listen twice as much as you talk. So there's an interesting principle from neurolinguistic programming, which is that the map is not the territory. And what NLP means by that is that whilst we might all be in the same space, and we might all be attending the same meeting, for example, we're not all having the same experience of that meeting. We have different maps to navigate our reality. We have different interpretations of what's going on. We're bringing our own set of beliefs and preconceived ideas to whatever situation we're in. So how do you have a really effective communication with somebody? Well, you want to get an idea about what their map is. And how do you get a good idea about what their map is? Well, you're going to listen more than you talk. So if I can try and gain as much of an understanding about this person's perspective and where they're coming from, then I really know how to come towards them, to meet them in the middle, so that we can find some common ground and some common understanding and move things forward. And I think never is this more important than when you're working alongside your boss or something like that, and you think, you know, I've got to ask my boss for something, and I need to pitch I need to make my pitch in terms of their map. So what is their map of this situation? What is important to them? What is their priorities? What's the language they use around this? I'm going to use their language and their map in order to build a bridge between us. So listen twice as much as you talk to have a really effective conversation. A good way to remember this is that you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, and to try to remember to use them in those proportions. And finally, number 6 is to take responsibility for how your message was received. And this is another principle from neurolinguistic programming, which says the meaning of your communication is the response you get. And what Richard Bandler really means here is determined by the response you get. So in any communication, there is a sender and there's a receiver. And I might think that I said something to a colleague which was in no way offensive, but they have taken offense to it. And if I actually acknowledge that they've taken offense to it, and I say, okay, well, maybe then what I said was offensive, then that gives me the opportunity to change the messaging and to try saying it in a different way and adapt my message so that the message lands in the way that I wanted it to be received. So this is about taking responsibility for how your message was received and adapting accordingly. So those are my 6 hacks. Number 1, communicate with clarity. That means using the PrEP framework to prepare for important conversations. Number 2, communicate with confidence. That means saying less, but with more impact. Number 3, use declarative statements rather than asking questions, make statements. Number 4, listen twice as much as you talk. Number 5, use stories to create sticky messages. And number 6, take responsibility for how your message is received. And in this way, you can have more meaningful conversations, build stronger relationships, because your impact on the world is only as great as your ability to communicate. These are the skills of the future. We can work on this if we become more conscious about the way we're communicating with each other. And in that way, we can become more desirable employees for the future world of work. I'm Carrie Swift from Love Public Speaking. We offer training for individuals, businesses, and schools, and on all sorts of topics such as presentation skills training, women's accelerator programs, virtual meetings, and more. I'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to get in touch, do connect with me on LinkedIn or come and visit our website, www.lovepublicspeaking.org.